You know how sometimes things happen at the right time? Just when I was planning to write a video about this very topic, I found out that Hololive Error was released on Steam, which is pretty cool. I ended up buying it myself just to see how it ran on Linux. You know, on a few occasions, whenever I talk to people in real life about computers and I mention the fact that I use a Linux-based operating system, I'm always met with confusion on their part as far as why would I subject myself to that? But in reality, Linux is pretty usable. In fact, I use a rolling release distribution, which makes it more prone to breakages due to constant bleeding edge package updates. And yet, not only am I still using it, but it's the most stable computer I've ever had. But I think more so than usability, the real question has to do with its ability to game. Now recently, because of the Steam Deck, there have been a lot of advancements in the gaming side of things due to Valve investing a lot in Proton. In case you don't know what Proton is, it's basically a compatibility layer that allows Windows applications to run on Linux. It's actually based on something called Wine, which I believe can also be used in other Unix-like operating systems such as Mac OS and FreeBSD. Now, the reason for why this is an important piece of software is because instead of game companies developing native Linux ports for their titles, we can instead run them under a compatibility layer. Now, of course, this method isn't perfect. Some games have really specific API requirements that can't be replicated under Proton very easily, and in several instances, you may run into some performance penalties or minor bugs. Yakuza 5, for example, is infamous for having audio sync issues, and Blue Reflection Second Light runs horribly because of the way data synchronizes between the CPU and GPU ever since Gust Games started using Direct3D11. Now, for Hololive Error, I got two different results. As far as my main gaming desktop, it doesn't work at all under default Proton. I will get an error pop out while launching the game. No way to advance beyond this. On my laptop though, the game does launch, but the menu looks like this. Spoiler alert, that's not how it's supposed to look. From what I could tell, I am capable of playing the game, but as you can clearly see in the footage, this game is running pitifully. This ain't a gaming laptop by any stretch of the imagination. Of course, given how there's already a report from someone confirming that the game runs out of the box with Proton 7.0.4, I decided to pick this exact version of the runner, and guess what? The game's playable, but I got this again. So yeah, I just can't win. However, if you run into these issues, there's a solid solution for this. You see, instead of using Steam's experimental version of Proton, what you can instead do is install the based version developed by Glorious Eggroll called Proton GE. I recommend using something called Proton Up-QT that will help you install any version of Proton GE. It's available on the flat hub that's already pinned into the taskbar if you're using KDE Plasma. Afterwards, you will need to enable Force the Use of Steam Play Compatibility tool and pick Proton GE. From what I was able to test, anything from version 7.28 and above should allow you to play this game. And that's pretty much it. Now, this would normally be the end of the video, as I've explained to you how to get the game running on Linux, and really there's not much left to do beyond here, at least as far as I've tested. However, there's still one version of this game that I need to address. You see, even though on Steam this was released on September 15th, I've actually had this game since July 18th, which was the actual release date of this game. So funnily enough, this would mean that I paid twice for the same game, but look, this game costs €8, I could buy this 6 times, I don't really care. The thing is, I've been following this game ever since the demo, and when it came to Linux, this always posed an issue. So remember that error I showed you earlier where the game crashes at launch? This was not a new issue to me. The same thing used to happen with the demo. Back then, the main solution was to install Wine staging, which is sort of like an alternative to Wine that has certain bug fixes that have not yet been implemented on mainline Wine. Doing this was enough to get the game running until we met the full version of the game, which introduced a new issue. Instead of the game crashing, the UI would completely break. This is how the game is supposed to look, with all the menu options and whatnot. But as you can see here, none of that exists. In fact, before the main menu, the game will give you a warning saying that it has frightening elements and that if you have a heart condition, maybe you shouldn't play it, you know, the usual. Yeah, even this warning was gone. And of course, as you would probably expect, I couldn't play the game like this. However, a solution quickly came. I immediately figured out that if you run this game using bottles, which is kind of like a graphical front end to Wine with some customizable features and accessible tools for installing additional dependencies, the game was playable. I finished the first route using bottles and overall not much to complain. Now there is another tool that is commonly used for Linux gaming called Lutris, which I also use it myself to play some games. It's pretty popular and for good reason, as on their website they actually have a database of games that you can pre-compile with all of the necessary wine prefixes in order to run the game specific without ever needing to mess up your default wine or Proton configuration. Now, with that said, I would not recommend you use Lutris to run Hololive Error because, at least in my experience, I was constantly getting kicked out of the game. I have no idea what was the exact source of this issue, and to be honest, I didn't really care to figure out, especially when I already had a working preset. At least to a certain point. Because, while I was planning this video, something unexpected happened. Now, to explain this, I will need to give you a little bit of context. You see, the program called Bottles that I have installed in my computer comes from the AUR, and for a while this package wasn't being updated to match the latest build pretty much ever since the beginning of August. And that's because in order to compile the newer builds, they needed a more recent version of libadwaita that hadn't yet been updated in the Arch repo. So until then, we were stuck with an older build for over a month. Of course, if you had the Flatpak version of Bottles, this wasn't really an issue because Flatpak, app image, and snap packages don't really need to worry much about these dependency issues, which is why they are often more recommended by the developers. It also helps in providing a universal build that should work with all Linux distributions. Now, I personally don't use universal package systems too much, mostly because I sometimes run into issues that I just simply don't have when I install a native package. Bottles is actually a good example of this because the Flatpak version, at least on my computer, has some graphical glitches and some Windows apps don't launch at all. So I just ended up resorting to the one available on the AUR. And I also didn't care if it was up to date or not because I mostly use it for one game and I was willing to wait however long I needed in order for the AUR pack to be updated. However, recently, as in September 15th, the package was finally updated. I didn't even notice at first. I was just minding my own business and noticed while doing the daily yay-syu that Bottles wasn't in the list of packages to be updated. Now, this may seem a bit confusing to some of you, let me explain. Basically, there was a bug that made it so Bottles was constantly listed as a package to be updated even when there wasn't actually any updates. This is a very specific issue. I'm sure many of you are probably confused right now, but trust me, this was something that was actually happening. But anyway, when I noticed that Bottles wasn't there, I was curious to see if the package had finally been updated. And I was right, the app did get updated, new interface and everything. Now at first, it was cool and all, but then I noticed something very quickly. Remember that issue I mentioned earlier about the menu options not being available? Well, yeah, that's right. This update broke the game. I tried everything in my power to get this game running again. I tried installing custom wine runners from Glorious Eggroll. Didn't work. If anything, it actually made things even worse by not even launching the game. I tried installing additional dependencies on Bottles such as .NET, WineMono, WineGecko, none of which work. I then decided to pick up a backed up configuration document listing all of the settings that I had customized for the previous games, or rather Bottle, and there were only two changes I was able to spot. The first one was that DXVK version on the newer build was lower than the one I was using for some reason. Tried updating to the latest one, didn't work. No surprise. The other thing I noticed was that in the previous Bottle, the system wine being used was of a lower version than the one I was using currently. Now here's the thing, I highly doubted that was the actual source of this issue, especially because if having the latest versions of wine was what was causing the UI to get fucked up, why didn't this game initially work when I first tried launching it directly through Wine when I first downloaded? Regardless, I wasn't going to waste my time downgrading the version of Wine just so I could reach a conclusion that I already knew, so I just skipped this step. What I did decide to do instead was try to see if an old trick would work, that being installing Wine Station, but this was about as useless as everything else I tried. At that point, I just started clicking buttons out of desperation, hoping that something would work, even if it was accidental. And then out of nowhere, I saw this option for renderer, as in the backend for Wine 3D. I then clicked on it and tried changing it to Vulkan out of curiosity, launched the game, and it worked? Wait, what? What do you mean? I don't understand. I never had to change this in the previous build. Why now? You know what? I don't care. It works again. That's all that matters. End of story. Some things that are worth noting is that they did recently release version 2.0 of the game, and there have been some differences like the fact that there's a skip button and the frame rate is no longer unlimited. In case you didn't know, previously this game would essentially max out your GPU and bring in as many frames as it could possibly render. However, now, at least in my case, the frame rate would generally target 60. I don't know if it's possible to increase it since the graphic settings are very limited. I do know that in the demo it seemed like the frame rate was adjusted based on the refresh rate of my monitor, so it typically targets 75 frames per second. Although I will say that as far as CPU usage, the full game is actually less demanding than the demo. In my case, I saw it drop from 20-ish to 11% average of CPU usage, which is pretty neat. Speaking of which, if you're wondering whether or not to play the Steam version or the digital copy that they send you from their website, I can't speak on behalf of Windows users, but as far as the Linux side of things, assuming that you're playing the game with the same setup I showed in this video, I would say that in general, performance-wise, the Steam version might be better. So, full disclosure, these are the specs of my computer, no overclocking. I feel like it's important to lay this out as your experience may vary depending on what system you have. I would also like to note that I played this game at high settings, so the results may tell a different story if you play this at lower settings. Now, what I've observed after testing both games is that in general, GPU usage in normal circumstances averages at around 71% with a frame rate of 60. Now, when you get to Chapter 2, when entering the school hallway, you will notice that the GPU usage will start increasing somewhat, at least in the Steam version, but the frame rate will remain more or less intact. The thing is, when I access the same area using bottles, the opposite will happen. The frame rate will actually drop by half, while the GPU usage mostly stays the same, if not lower, because I saw it even hitting the 60s. Of course, these are moments where some portions of the campaign prove to be a bit more taxing on the GPU, but both versions of the game seem to exhibit different behaviors, and to be honest, I can't even really tell if this is something exclusive to the digital copy. What I can say is that even the 1.0 version of the game, the one I initially downloaded, does the exact same thing, which is crazy because that version is literally programmed to max out the video card, and it's still limiting the GPU usage by the same amount. Now here's the thing, what I'm experiencing right now is probably something that could be worked around if I investigate this a bit further and try tinkering with the configuration. But the truth is, compared to just simply launching the game off of Steam without a custom Proton runner, I think we all know what's the superior option, or at the very least the most convenient one. There are other disadvantages of running the game through Wine, like the fact that if you minimize the program, tap the start button, or just click on another window, it will cause the keyboard to no longer be recognized. It's a bug that I've experienced with a few games. It doesn't happen all the time. It occurs with some games, and Hololive error happens to be one of them. Steam games, of course, have never exhibited this bug, so because I don't want to live in anxiety every time I tab out of the window, or even the game itself when it redirects me to a web page when I click certain links, I'd rather just play it on Steam for less stress. Now, I've been talking mostly about Linux, but I'm sure most of you will just end up playing this on Windows 10 or 11, so a lot of this probably doesn't matter much to you, but I do think it's important to highlight all of this for two reasons. For one, due to the rise of the Steam Deck, which is based on Arch Linux, all of this will be important to take into consideration, especially if you're interested in playing this on the go. The other reason for why I'm compelled to share all of this is because following all of this testing, I decided to play the game under my Windows 11 build. And I will say that in general, this game does run better on Windows. Of course, I was using two different overlay tools, so maybe there may be some discrepancies between the two, but assuming they're both giving fully accurate results, it runs noticeably better on Windows. It's less taxing on the GPU, managing to drop below 70% even during the same areas that I was evaluating earlier. I didn't test the digital copy that I have because that would require me to log into my Hololive account to download the same file, and I just simply couldn't be bothered to do it. I don't really like logging into any of my accounts when I boot up Windows, but I assume the end result would probably be the same. However, I like looking at the Judgment games, for example, a series of games that came out very recently on Steam and went platinum at launch, which is pretty wild. Our biggest disadvantage right now is really the fact that most developers don't consider Linux when making their games. At the end of the day, Windows still represents the vast majority of the marketplace in computers, so it makes sense that it's the main priority. But I always like testing games when I can to see how far we've advanced. For example, I've been able to play Storm 4 at 4K in 60 frames per second by upscaling the resolution from 1440p to 4K using FSR, which isn't natively supported in the game, by the way. It's something you can actually manually configure by simply using a custom Proton runner. Automatically, this is a better experience than what I'm getting even on a PS5. And you know, at the end of the day, when I consider the fact that Hololive Error is exclusively a Windows game, I gotta say, for running a Windows application on a different operating system, this ain't half bad. Thinking about it, the results aren't actually that different from what I get on Windows. I would play this on the Arch, and ultimately, I think that's just truly what I want. Though, with that said, Cover, I would really appreciate if you offer support for a gamepad and maybe give me more options for graphic settings.